Hey, thanks so much for joining us here on 90s Plus. I'm 90s meteorologist Chris Bianchi to look at what you might be able to expect for the upcoming winter. And yes, we're going to put our money where our mouths are. We are going to reveal our official predictions in terms of snowfall amounts for the Denver area as well as for the entire state of Colorado in terms of snowpack percentage. I'll explain all that here in just a second, but a bit of a broad view before we show you those predictions. We're heading into the 2023-2024 winter, and as many of you know, we often get snow deep into the winter season. It is often normally spring when we get some of those big snowfall totals, so we may, for example, come December, January or February, we can often have some lagging snowfall amounts. We can make those up come February, come March, come April, and in some cases that might be what we're expecting. In fact, most of our team of meteorologists, we expect a slow start to the snow season. So September, October, November, I think most of us in general expecting a bit of a slower start and a warmer than average fall. But by the time we get to the middle of the season, that's when we expect things to ramp on up. And by the way, that would continue a trend of what we've seen over the last 20-25 years, where we've seen quite warm falls and often drier than usual falls, and that has often led to some fairly notable spikes in mid-winter snowfall. So December, January, and February. Again, if you're unfamiliar with the Denver area and throughout the state of Colorado, March is often our snowiest month of the year. But in recent years, we've noted that January and February have turned quite a bit snowier compared to the last few years. That may have something to do with a warming climate overall, as we're kind of pushing those peak seasons a bit more towards the middle of the winter, but that's speculative. That said, this is more definitive. The main driving factor behind our winter weather predictions is this. You've probably heard of it: El Nino. Before we get into what El Nino might do for us here in Colorado, here's a bit of a broad view about what exactly El Nino is. And simply put, it means warmer than average sea surface temperatures across the central Pacific Ocean. Now, again, bit of a weather geography 101. The Pacific Ocean is by far the largest body of water on Earth. And therefore, what happens in the Pacific Ocean has a bit of a domino effect on the rest of the world's weather. And that does, in fact, impact us here in Colorado. What it tends to do is it strengthens those little arrows you're seeing going from left to right on your screen. Those would be the subtropical jet stream. What tends to happen, and this can vary. This is one piece of evidence that we've got over the trillions of different things that impact your weather on a day-to-day basis. This is one, admittedly big, but just one factor within all of that. Now, what that can do is it strengthens the subtropical jet stream, and that can also strengthen an area high pressure over southern Canada. And what that means for us here in Colorado is that subtropical jet stream tends to pump in a lot more moisture. It also warms us on up and tends to bring more moisture to the southern half of the state. A lot of you might know that El Ninos, generally speaking, those impacts from an El Nino or a La Nina tend to be fairly, how do I put this, blunted for us here in Colorado. And that's because if you look at this geography here, folks, we're in the middle of the continent, and El Ninos, La Ninas tend to impact more the kind of fringes of it, the areas closer to bodies of water that tend to feel those impacts a bit more. But for us here in Colorado, we often do see a wetter than average season for the southern part of the state. So the San Juans, the Sangre de Cristos, as well as on up into the Wet Mountains, the Saguache Ranges. Those are the areas that, generally speaking, can get a snowier than average season. Now, for us here in Denver, as I reveal our official prediction, and by the way, this is an average of our 7 meteorologists' individual picks. The average for here in the Denver area, we collectively went with about 52 inches of seasonal snowfall. Now, this is based on Denver International Airport's measuring. So the central part of the city averaged actually a little over about 10 inches more than the airport does. The airport tends to get less upslope flow, so sometimes you can get these mid-season snowstorms. If you're a bit of a weather buff, you probably already knew this, that the central part of the city often gets quite a bit more snowfall than the airport. The airport often gets quite a bit less than downtown. Point being, this is based on DIA. We are expecting a slightly above average snowfall season in Denver. In fact, out of our 7 meteorologists, 6 had above average snowfall totals for the city of Denver. The only, by the way, the only person who disagreed with that was meteorologist Corey Reppenhagen, who said that we would have 44 inches of snow in Denver, which is slightly below average for us. But one thing we were unanimous about, and looking ahead at the mountain season, in the mountains, we collectively went with 92%. Again, this is an average of our 7 meteorologists' individual picks, and we're talking about snowpack. This is the snow water equivalent. This is the amount of snowfall. Obviously, 100% would be an average season, 110 would be above average, 92 represents a below average season. Not by a ton, but this is a below average season. In fact, all 7 of our meteorologists picked a below average season in the mountains. Again, you can tell 92 out of 100, not overwhelming in that number, but quite a few of us did have, or all of us did have below average seasons. And I'll say I actually had the lowest number. I had an 85% of season average, and that's partially because those impacts from an El Nino can be very wonky. Often what we tend to see from an El Nino is that sometimes that moisture just stays too far south, and in an El Nino season, what often happens, because it is warmer overall, is that we tend to be a bit more dependent on getting big storms. Now, El Ninos do increase the possibility of getting a big storm, especially for us here along the Front Range in the Denver area. So sometimes those big snowstorms in January, February, and March, they tend to come during an El Nino season. Not always. We've had them in La Ninas, we've had them in neutral seasons, but in an El Nino, we tend to have a slightly higher possibility of getting one of those big snowstorms. That's why I think the majority of our team of meteorologists going with an above average season for us here in the Denver area. I'll say this personally as well, is it's been a couple of years since we've had one of those big 18 plus inch snowstorms for us here in the Denver area. And my feeling between that and also the fact that we got an El Nino, that tells me, or gives me a nudge, that we will get one of those bigger snowstorms this upcoming winter season. We've also had quite a few close calls in recent winters. The other thing that comes into play with an El Nino is, again, tends to rob the northern mountains of a fair bit of that snowfall. And I think we're all fairly, we're close enough here, and we're recording this, by the way, on September the 6th. So recording this in the first week of the month of September. The computer forecast models going out about 60 to 90 days are all pretty unanimous in the fact that we're going to have a dry and warm fall. So the next 2 to 3 months, I would anticipate October and November to probably get off to a slow start in terms of the snowfall amounts for the mountains, and even for us here along the Front Range. Would not be surprised if we have to wait once again into the month of November for our first measurable snowfall. But what we've again seen in recent years, in recent seasons, is that the middle of our snowpack season in December, in January and February, that's where we've seen quite a bit of snowfall. And that's my personal expectation, I think, for quite a few of our meteorologists as well, is that we'll get quite a bit of snow in the middle of the season that'll help us catch up, but probably not quite fully get to a full season. Another thing is we've had a couple of really good snow years. The winter of 2022-2023 was awesome. We finished with about 115% of our statewide snowpack, so we had a very, very good winter just a year ago, and it's not too common these days that we get back-to-back really good winters like the one we just had. We've also had a pretty good run of decent to a well above average snowpack seasons in recent years, and again, nowadays we tend to not see that continue for a prolonged stretch. So I think there's an overall lean towards a below average season. Again, all of our meteorologists picking a below average snowpack season for us this upcoming winter. So again, overall takeaways, a lot of El Nino thought, a lot of recent history in mind. The general lean would be a slightly above average snowfall season in Denver, slightly below average snowfall season for the mountains. So hopefully it gives you a good idea about what to expect, and I'm sure you'll hold us accountable come next spring, really next summer, as again we can have those snowfalls as late as May or even June here in Colorado. So have some fun with that. Hopefully it gives you a good idea about what we're looking at in terms of those long-term seasonal snowfall trends.